Henry Williams walked slowly through the park, his cane tapping softly against the asphalt path. It was late afternoon, and the winter sun cast long shadows across the benches and bare trees. The park was mostly empty, save for a few joggers and a couple walking their dog in the distance. He had always found solace in this quiet spot, a place to think and breathe away from the confines of his small apartment. But today was different. Henry had noticed them earlier, a group of 5 young men loitering near the playground. They had the unmistakable air of trouble, their laughter loud and cutting, their eyes scanning the park with predatory intent. Henry had hoped they wouldn't notice him, but as he turned a corner near the park's small pond, he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps quickening behind him. "Hey, old man," one of them shouted. The voice was mocking, laced with a cruel edge. Henry's grip on his cane tightened, and he tried to keep walking, ignoring them. But the footsteps grew louder, and soon they surrounded him. The leader, a tall man with a shaved head and a leather jacket, stepped forward, a sneer on his face. "Look at this guy," he said, addressing his friends. "Ain't he just a picture of America's past glory? Bet he thinks he's better than us." "I don't want any trouble," Henry said, his voice calm but firm. He'd seen enough violence in his years as a Marine and later as a police officer. He knew how quickly things could escalate. "Oh, you don't want trouble?" the leader mocked. "Well, too bad, because we do." One of the younger men, barely out of his teens, snatched Henry's cap off his head and tossed it to another, laughing. "What's this, Grandpa? A Marine hat? Did you fight for freedom or just to keep people like us down?" Henry felt the heat of anger rise in his chest but forced himself to stay calm. "I fought for all Americans," he said. "Even fools like you." The leader's face darkened. "What did you just call us?" He shoved Henry hard in the chest, making him stumble backward. His cane clattered to the ground. "Leave him alone," a voice called out from a nearby bench. A woman, perhaps in her 30s, had stood up, her phone in hand. "I'm calling the police." The leader turned to her, his eyes narrowing. "Mind your own business, lady, unless you want to be next." But the distraction gave Henry a moment. He reached for his cane and gripped it tightly, using it to steady himself as he stood. He locked eyes with the leader, his military training kicking in despite his age. "You've had your fun," he said, his voice steady. "Now walk away." The leader smirked. "Or what, old man?" Henry's gaze didn't waver. "Or you'll regret it." The gang laughed, but there was a flicker of hesitation in the leader's eyes. Henry's calm demeanor and unyielding stance had unnerved him, if only slightly. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He pulled a knife from his pocket, the blade glinting in the pale sunlight. "Oh, you've done it now, Grandpa." Before the man could take a step closer, Henry swung his cane with surprising speed, striking the leader's hand and sending the knife flying into the grass. The group froze for a moment, shocked by the old man's sudden agility. "Get him," one of them shouted. The next few moments were a blur of chaos. Henry swung his cane in wide arcs, using it to keep the attackers at bay. He managed to knock one to the ground, but another struck him from behind, sending him sprawling. As he lay there, struggling to rise, the gang began to close in, their kicks and punches landing with brutal force. Henry curled into a ball, trying to protect his head and vital organs. The world around him became a haze of pain and shouting. Then, suddenly, a piercing whistle cut through the air. The sound was followed by the barking of a large dog and the shouts of several people. A jogger had rushed over with his German shepherd, and others from the park were closing in, their phones out, capturing the assault. The gang hesitated, realizing they were outnumbered and on camera. They cursed and fled, disappearing into the trees as the dog barked after them. Henry lay on the ground, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. The jogger knelt beside him, his dog standing guard. "Sir, are you okay?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "I'll be fine," Henry said, though his body ached with every breath. He allowed the man to help him sit up, and the woman who had first intervened draped her coat over his shoulders. The police arrived minutes later, followed by an ambulance. As Henry was loaded onto a stretcher, he looked at the faces of the strangers who had come to his aid. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse but sincere. One of the officers approached him. We'll find those punks, he promised. And we'll make sure they face justice? Henry nodded, but his mind was already elsewhere. This wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a symptom of something deeper, something darker that had taken root in the country he had fought so hard to protect. As the ambulance doors closed, he resolved that he wouldn't let this attack define him. He had faced worse and survived. He would heal, and he would fight back, not with violence, but with the same strength and determination that had carried him through war and life. Henry Williams lay in the ambulance, the rhythmic hum of the vehicle barely cutting through the throbbing in his head. The paramedics worked efficiently, cleaning his wounds and checking his vitals. Yet his thoughts were elsewhere, on the gang of attackers and the hatred he'd seen in their eyes. That wasn't new. He'd fought racism all his life, but today it had felt personal. Targeted. Miles away, Jackson Williams, Henry's son, was leaving a strategy meeting at Fort Benning. A U.S. Army general known for his precision and commanding presence, Jackson had earned respect not just for his battlefield prowess but for his commitment to protecting the vulnerable. As he walked to his car, his phone vibrated in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a missed call from an unknown number. Moments later, another call came through. This time he answered. "General Williams," he said. "Sir, this is Officer Harrington from the Columbus Police Department. Your father's been attacked at Riverbend Park. He's on his way to Memorial Hospital, but I thought you'd want to know." The words hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. He clenched his jaw. "How bad is it?" "He's conscious, sir, but he was outnumbered. Witnesses say a group of young men assaulted him. Racial slurs were reportedly used." The officer didn't need to elaborate. Jackson's mind filled in the blanks. "I'm on my way," he said, his tone sharp and decisive. At the park, chaos still lingered. The police had cordoned off the area, taking statements from witnesses. A jogger and his German shepherd stood nearby, the dogs still on high alert, while the woman who had called for help argued with an officer about the urgency of finding the gang. "They ran into the woods," she insisted, her voice shaking. "Why aren't you chasing them?" "We're doing what we can, ma'am," the officer replied, his tone measured but tired. As Jackson pulled up in his black SUV, his military uniform still on, he surveyed the scene with a practiced eye. His presence was immediate and commanding. The officers straightened, sensing his authority. "Where's my father?" Jackson demanded. An officer pointed toward the ambulance, now parked to the side. Jackson marched over, his boots crunching against the gravel. He climbed inside and saw Henry sitting upright, bruised but alert. "Dad," Jackson said, his voice softer now. "Are you okay?" Henry forced a weak smile. "I've been through worse, son. But I'm glad to see you." Jackson gripped his father's hand, his eyes darkening with restrained fury. "Who did this?" "A bunch of punks," Henry said. "They thought I'd be an easy target. And they had words for me. Words I haven't heard since the 60s. While the ambulance prepared to leave, Jackson stepped outside, his mind already formulating a plan. He approached Officer Harrington, who had been coordinating the search efforts. "Any leads on the attackers?" Jackson asked. "A few witnesses saw them heading into the woods," Harrington replied. "We're combing the area, but they could be long gone." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "Not if I have anything to say about it." He pulled out his phone and made a call. "Captain Diaz, get a team together. Meet me at Riverbend Park. We've got a situation." Within minutes, a military transport vehicle arrived, carrying a group of soldiers from the local base. Armed but disciplined, they immediately fell in line behind Jackson. The sight of them made the officers pause, unsure of how to proceed. "What's going on here?" one of the officers asked. "An intervention," Jackson said. "This is my jurisdiction now." Harrington hesitated. "General, with all due respect, this is a police matter." Jackson stepped closer, his tone icy. "And this is my father. Your jurisdiction ends where your inaction begins. My team will assist in securing this area and locating those responsible." Realizing he wouldn't win this argument, Harrington nodded reluctantly. "Just don't do anything that'll make my job harder." The search began, the soldiers moving methodically through the woods with the precision of a trained unit. Jackson led them, his instincts sharp. It didn't take long to find signs of the gang's presence: discarded beer cans, footprints in the mud, and the faint sound of laughter echoing through the trees. "Split into 2 teams," Jackson ordered. "Surround the area and flush them out." The soldiers moved swiftly, their movements silent but deliberate. As they closed in, the gang came into view, lounging near a dilapidated shed. The leader, still wearing his leather jacket, was boasting about the attack. "Did you see his face when I pulled the knife?" He laughed. "Bet he'll think twice before walking through our park again." The others laughed, their voices dripping with arrogance. Jackson stepped into the clearing, his soldiers flanking him. "On your feet," he barked, his voice cutting through the air like a whip. The gang froze, their bravado evaporating. The leader sneered, trying to mask his fear. "Who the hell are you?" "Your worst nightmare," Jackson said, stepping closer. "You attacked an unarmed veteran. My father. And now, you're going to answer for it?" The leader scoffed. "What, you gonna lecture us? You don't scare me." Jackson's expression didn't change. "Good. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to stop you." One of the soldiers stepped forward, his rifle slung across his chest. "Do what he says or this gets ugly." The gang hesitated, but their leader wasn't ready to back down. He reached for his pocket, but before he could pull anything out, Jackson moved with lightning speed, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it until he dropped the hidden knife with a yelp. "Stupid move," Jackson said, his voice low and menacing. The rest of the gang tried to scatter, but the soldiers were faster, corralling them into a tight group. Within moments, they were subdued, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. "You think you're tough?" Jackson said, addressing the leader. "Picking on an old man? Using racial slurs? You're nothing but cowards." The leader glared at him, but his bravado was gone. "You can't do this," he muttered. "We got rights." "And so does my father," Jackson shot back. "But you didn't seem to care about that, did you?" When the police arrived to take the gang into custody, Jackson handed them over without a word. He watched as the officers led the group away, his anger still simmering. Back at the hospital, Jackson sat by his father's bedside. Henry looked at him, his eyes filled with pride. "You didn't have to do all that, son." "Yes, I did," Jackson replied. "You taught me to stand up for what's right. And I'm not about to let anyone take that away from us." Henry nodded, a small smile on his lips. "You've always been my hero, Jackson. Today, you proved it again." As father and son sat together, the weight of the day began to lift. But the fight against hatred and bigotry was far from over, and they both knew it. In the weeks following the attack, Henry Williams worked through the physical pain in silence, refusing to let his injuries define him. His son Jackson, however, could not let it go. The incident at the park wasn't an isolated act of hate, it was too organized, too deliberate. The gang members hadn't just been punks looking for trouble, they had moved with a cruel precision that troubled Jackson's trained eye. Something deeper was at play, and his instincts told him to dig further. Jackson returned to his office on the base, determined to learn more. He had connections within military intelligence and law enforcement that could uncover what the local police might miss. He started by requesting access to the gang members' records. With their arrests, there had to be something: prior offenses, affiliations, anything that would provide answers. By the end of the day, a report landed on Jackson's desk. What he read made his stomach turn. The 5 men were members of a far-right extremist group calling themselves the Iron Sons. Their leader, a man named Garrett Vance, was well known to federal agencies but had managed to avoid significant legal consequences. The group was known for spreading hate-filled rhetoric online and organizing small-scale attacks designed to terrorize minority communities. Jackson realized that the attack on his father might have been more than a random act. It could have been part of a larger plan. Jackson immediately called in a favor from an old friend, Special Agent Laura Peters of the FBI. Laura had been tracking hate groups like the Iron Sons for years and didn't hesitate to get involved. "General Williams," she said during their meeting in a secure conference room, "I wish I could say I'm surprised, but these groups are getting bolder every day. The attack on your father may have been a test run for something much bigger." Jackson's jaw tightened. "What do you mean?" Laura pulled out a series of photos and documents. We've been monitoring encrypted communications between Iron Sun's chapters across the country. They're planning a coordinated series of attacks, targeting veterans, civil rights leaders, and minority-owned businesses. It's designed to instill fear and provoke chaos. Henry, who had insisted on attending the briefing despite his injuries, frowned deeply. So my attack was a message? Laura nodded. Exactly. Your service and identity made you a symbol to them. They wanted to send a message that even heroes like you aren't safe. Henry clenched his fists. They picked the wrong man to mess with. Jackson placed a reassuring hand on his father's shoulder before turning to Laura. What's the plan to stop them? We need intel, Laura said. The men arrested after your father's attack are low-level grunts. If we can get one of them to talk, we might learn more about the organization's plans. The next morning, Jackson accompanied Laura to the interrogation room where the leader of the gang, Marcus Skinned Rourke, sat cuffed to a metal table. Rourke had been defiant since his arrest, smirking through every question and refusing to cooperate. Jackson leaned against the wall as Laura began. You've got two choices, Marcus, Laura said, her tone icy. Cooperate and maybe we'll cut you a deal. Or stay silent and take the fall for everything your group has done. Rourke chuckled, leaning back in his chair. You think I'm scared of a couple of feds? Go ahead, lock me up. The Iron Suns are bigger than me. You can't stop what's coming. Jackson stepped forward, his towering presence filling the room. He placed both hands on the table, his face inches from Rourke's. Let me make something clear, he said, his voice low and dangerous. You hurt my father. You're damn lucky I'm letting the justice system deal with you instead of handling this myself. But if you think for 1 second that I won't do everything in my power to tear your little organization apart, you're even dumber than you look. Rourke's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. Big words, General. But you're too late. The Suns are already in motion. There's nothing you can do to stop it. Jackson and Laura left the interrogation frustrated but more determined than ever. With Rourke tight-lipped, they had to rely on other methods to uncover the Iron Sun's plans. Jackson reached out to his network, gathering intel from military and federal databases. Laura's team worked around the clock, analyzing online forums and tracking encrypted messages. Their breakthrough came days later when an undercover agent embedded in another Iron Sun's chapter provided a crucial tip. The group was planning to attack a community center hosting a veteran support event. The event was only 2 days away, giving Jackson and Laura little time to act. Are you sure about this intel? Jackson asked during a late-night strategy meeting. Laura nodded. It's solid. If we can intercept them at the center, we might be able to take down their entire operation. The day of the event, Jackson personally led a team to secure the community center. Soldiers and federal agents disguised themselves as attendees, blending seamlessly with the crowd. Henry insisted on attending, despite Jackson's protests. They came after me, Jackson, Henry said. I won't let them scare me into hiding. As the event began, everything seemed normal. Veterans and their families mingled, sharing stories and enjoying the warm atmosphere. But Jackson remained on edge, his eyes scanning every corner of the room. Suddenly, a van screeched to a halt outside the building. Jackson's instincts kicked in as he saw several men jump out, armed and masked. Positions, he barked, his voice cutting through the room. The attackers stormed the entrance, shouting slurs and threats. But they were met with an unexpected sight. Dozens of armed soldiers and agents drawing their weapons. Drop your weapons, Jackson commanded. The attackers hesitated, clearly unprepared for the ambush. Some dropped their weapons immediately, while others attempted to flee. But the soldiers moved with precision, subduing the attackers within minutes. Henry watched from the sidelines, a mix of pride and anger on his face. You underestimated us, he muttered. In the aftermath, the FBI raided several Iron Sun's hideouts, dismantling their network. Laura informed Jackson that the operation had dealt a significant blow to the organization. You and your father made a difference, she said. Jackson looked at Henry, who was talking with a group of veterans. This fight isn't over, Jackson said. But at least we're one step closer to justice. As the sun set over the city, father and son stood together, united in their resolve to stand against hate. They knew the battle was far from over, but they also knew they wouldn't back down. Not now. Not ever. Jackson Williams sat in his office, reviewing the intelligence gathered during the FBI's recent raids. The takedown of the Iron Sons at the community center had been a major victory, but the elusive mastermind, Dennis Hunt, remained at large. Hunt wasn't just the leader of the local gang, he was the architect behind the Iron Sons' coordinated hate-fueled campaigns. If they didn't find him soon, the group could regroup and strike again. Henry, determined as ever despite his healing injuries, walked into the room with a slight limp. "Any leads on this Hunt guy?" he asked, setting a cup of coffee on Jackson's desk. "Not yet," Jackson replied, his voice tight with frustration. "He's good at covering his tracks. But someone like him doesn't stay quiet for long." As if on cue, Jackson's phone buzzed. It was Laura Peters, the FBI agent who had been working closely with them. "We've got a break," Laura said. A known associate of Dennis Hunt was spotted in Atlanta. Surveillance teams followed him to a warehouse in an industrial district. "It looks like a hub for their operations." Jackson's eyes sharpened. "Do you think Hunt is there?" "It's possible," Laura replied. "Even if he's not, we might find something that leads us to him. I'm sending you the address now." Henry stood straighter, determination etched on his face. "Then let's move." That evening, Jackson and Henry arrived at the industrial district, their presence bolstered by a team of FBI agents and soldiers. The warehouse loomed in the shadows, its exterior giving little indication of the sinister activity within. Jackson directed the team, his voice calm but commanding. "We move in silently. We don't want to spook them. Henry, you stay back." Henry frowned. "You're not leaving me out of this?" "Dad, this isn't up for debate," Jackson said. "You're still recovering." "I've faced worse than this," Henry shot back, his voice firm. "And this fight isn't just yours. It's mine too." Jackson hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Stay close to me." The team breached the warehouse doors quietly, their movements precise. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. The warehouse was dimly lit, but the faint hum of activity echoed from deeper within. They moved through the maze of crates and machinery, eventually reaching a large open area. There, several men were gathered around a table, their conversation laced with racial slurs and laughter. Maps, weapons, and stacks of cash were spread out before them. Jackson signaled for the team to hold their positions. He scanned the faces, his heart pounding when he recognized Dennis Hunt at the head of the table. Hunt was a burly man with a cruel face, his every gesture exuding arrogance and control. Henry whispered, "That's him?" Jackson nodded. "That's him." Laura's voice crackled softly through their earpieces. "We need him alive, Jackson. He's the key to dismantling the rest of this network." Jackson took a deep breath and gave the signal. The team moved in quickly, surrounding the group. "FBI! Don't move!" Laura shouted, stepping into the light. Chaos erupted. Most of Hunt's men froze, their hands shooting into the air. But Hunt wasn't about to go down without a fight. He grabbed a gun from the table and fired a shot, forcing everyone to scatter. Jackson and Henry ducked behind a crate as bullets whizzed past them. Jackson glanced at his father. "Stay here." Ignoring the order, Henry grabbed a nearby metal pipe and crouched low, making his way around the chaos. Jackson, meanwhile, flanked Hunt, who was using the table as cover. "Dennis Hunt." Jackson bellowed. "It's over. Drop your weapon." Hunt laughed darkly. "You think I'm scared of you, soldier boy? You're just another puppet for a broken system." Henry suddenly appeared behind Hunt, using the pipe to knock the gun from his hand. Hunt spun around, swinging wildly, but Henry ducked and delivered a solid punch to his jaw. Jackson rushed forward, pinning Hunt to the ground while the agents secured the rest of the men. Hunt struggled, spitting venomous slurs, but Jackson held firm. "You're done," Jackson said, his voice cold. With Hunt in custody, the team began searching the warehouse. What they found was worse than any of them had anticipated. Computers containing encrypted files revealed plans for large-scale attacks, including targeted bombings and assassinations. There were detailed dossiers on community leaders, journalists, and politicians, All people Hunt's network deemed threats to their hateful agenda. Henry stood over one of the computers, his fists clenched. This isn't just hate. It's terrorism. Laura nodded grimly. This is bigger than we thought. With this evidence, we can shut down their entire operation. As the team continued their search, Henry noticed a stack of letters in a locked drawer. Breaking it open, he found handwritten notes from various members of the Iron Sons. One in particular stood out. It was addressed to Hunt and detailed a plan to target Jackson himself. Henry's blood ran cold. Jackson, you need to see this. Jackson read the letter, his jaw tightening. They were coming after me? They know you're a threat, Laura said. And they wanted to eliminate you before you could stop them. Jackson's eyes burned with fury, but his voice remained steady. Then we make sure they never get the chance? As Hunt was loaded into a police van, he glared at Jackson and Henry. You think this is over? He snarled. There are more of us out there. You can't stop what's coming. Henry stepped forward, his voice calm but resolute. You're wrong. Hate like yours thrives in the shadows. But we're dragging it into the light. And when people see you for what you are, you'll lose. Hunt laughed, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. As the van doors closed, Henry turned to Jackson. This isn't just about us anymore. It's about stopping people like him from tearing this country apart. Jackson nodded. And we will. Together. In the weeks that followed, the evidence recovered from the warehouse led to a series of arrests across the country. The Iron Sons network was dismantled piece by piece, their leaders brought to justice. For Henry and Jackson, the fight wasn't just about revenge. It was about standing up to hate and proving that courage and unity could overcome even the darkest forces. Though the battle was far from over, they faced the future with unshakable resolve, ready to fight for what was right, no matter the cost. The chill of early dawn settled over the suburban neighborhood, where a nondescript house stood at the end of a cul-de-sac. To most, it looked ordinary, a simple, well-maintained structure with white siding and a neatly trimmed lawn. But to Jackson Williams, Henry, and the team gathered outside, it was a lair of hate and violence. The final piece of intelligence from Dennis Hunt's captured files had led them here, revealing it as the hub for the Iron Sons' most dangerous activities. The atmosphere crackled with tension. Federal agents, SWAT teams, and local police officers crouched behind armored vehicles, waiting for the signal. Jackson, dressed in tactical gear, surveyed the scene with sharp eyes. His father, Henry, stood beside him, his face a mask of determination. Are you sure you want to be here, Dad? Jackson asked, his voice low. Henry didn't flinch. I've fought battles before, son. This one's no different. Besides, I need to see this through. Jackson gave a small nod, his respect for his father evident. Stay close. We move as a team. Inside the house, Dennis Hunt paced nervously. His arrest at the warehouse had been a setback, but his network had bailed him out before he could be transported. Now, surrounded by a skeleton crew of loyal accomplices, he was scrambling to erase evidence and move his operations elsewhere. This place is compromised, Dennis growled to his men. Get those hard drives wiped and the cache loaded. We're not sticking around for the feds to come knocking. One of his men, a wiry figure named Clark, hesitated. Boss, what if we fight back? We've got enough firepower to hold them off. Dennis glared at him, his tone dripping with venom. This isn't a movie, idiot. You think a shootout with the FBI ends with us walking away? Get moving. Outside, the final preparations were underway. Laura Peters, the FBI agent leading the operation, spoke into her radio. Team Alpha, are you in position? Affirmative, came the reply. Team Bravo? In position? Laura turned to Jackson. It's your call, General. Jackson took a deep breath and gave the order. Execute. The raid began with a thunderous crash as the SWAT team breached the front door. Flashbang grenades exploded inside, their deafening noise and blinding light stunning the occupants. Agents poured in, their weapons drawn and their voices commanding. FBI! Hands in the air. Dennis and his men scrambled, some reaching for weapons while others froze in panic. Clark, emboldened by his earlier bravado, fired wildly toward the entryway. His bullets slammed into walls and furniture but missed their mark, Jackson and Henry moved with precision, staying close to the main team. Jackson barked orders, his military training evident in every word. Secure the east wing. Watch your corners. Henry, armed with a bulletproof vest and a stun gun, covered Jackson's flank. He spotted one of Dennis's men attempting to flee through a side door and shouted, "Stop." When the man ignored him, Henry fired the stun gun, the electric current dropping the accomplice instantly. Inside the control room, Dennis grabbed a duffel bag filled with cash and a pistol. He sneered at the chaos outside the door. "Idiots," he muttered, shoving past his men. As he moved toward the back exit, he came face to face with Jackson. The two locked eyes, and for a moment, the air seemed to freeze. "Dennis Hunt," Jackson said, his voice steady and commanding. "It's over. Put the weapon down." Dennis raised the pistol, his hand shaking slightly. "You don't know who you're messing with, soldier boy. You think you can take me down? You're nothing but a pawn." Jackson stepped closer, his movements deliberate. "You're outnumbered and outgunned. Drop the weapon before you get someone killed." Dennis laughed bitterly. "I'd rather die than rot in some prison." Before he could raise the gun higher, Henry appeared from the side, his stun gun firing. Dennis convulsed as the electricity surged through him, the pistol falling from his grasp. He collapsed to the ground, groaning. Jackson moved quickly, securing Dennis's hands with zip ties. "You had your chance," he said coldly. The rest of the raid proceeded with precision. Dennis's remaining men were subdued one by one, their weapons confiscated. Agents swept through the house, seizing hard drives, stacks of cash, and files containing detailed plans for future attacks. In the basement, they discovered a grim trove: propaganda materials, weapons caches, and photographs of targets. One wall was covered with maps and red strings connecting cities, marking the locations of potential attacks. Laura arrived, her face grim as she examined the evidence. "This is a gold mine," she said. "We've got enough here to dismantle their entire network." Jackson nodded, his gaze lingering on the hate-filled materials. "This isn't just about arresting them. It's about stopping their message from spreading." As Dennis was hauled away in handcuffs, he spat venomous words at Jackson and Henry. "You think this changes anything? There'll always be people like me. You can't stop the truth." Henry stepped forward, his voice calm but cutting. "The only truth here is that hate like yours is a disease. And it's people like us who will keep fighting to cure it." Dennis sneered but said nothing more as he was shoved into a waiting police van. Back at the command post, Jackson, Henry, and Laura reviewed the operation's success. "We got him," Laura said. "And with the evidence we collected, his entire organization is finished." Henry, still catching his breath, leaned back in his chair. "It's not just about this one group. There are others out there, spreading the same poison. We've got to stay vigilant." Jackson placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "We will. This was a victory, but it's just one battle in a much larger war." As the sun rose over the city, father and son stood side by side, their resolve unshaken. They had faced hate head-on and emerged victorious, but they knew the fight was far from over. Together, they would continue to stand against the darkness, proving that courage, unity, and justice could triumph over even the deepest hatred. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with journalists, community leaders, and citizens eager to witness the culmination of justice. The trial of Dennis Hunt and his accomplices had garnered national attention, not just for the scale of their crimes, but for what their sentencing represented: a decisive stand against organized hate and violence. Henry Williams sat in the front row, his body still carrying the marks of the brutal attack he had suffered, but his spirit was unbroken. Beside him sat Jackson, stoic in his uniform, exuding the calm determination of a man who had seen battle and refused to flinch in the face of adversity. Laura Peters, the FBI agent who had worked tirelessly to dismantle the Iron Sons, sat to Jackson's left, her notebook in hand as she watched the proceedings with keen interest. The defendants sat at the defense table, shackled and glaring. Dennis Hunt, the leader of the Iron Sons, wore an expression of defiance, his eyes scanning the room as though daring anyone to challenge him. His co-defendants shifted nervously, their bravado from the raid replaced with the cold reality of facing justice. The trial had been grueling, with weeks of testimony and evidence painting a chilling picture of the Iron Sons' activities. Prosecutors presented hundreds of pieces of evidence seized during the raid, encrypted communications, financial records, and even video footage of their planning sessions. Witnesses testified to the violence and terror the group had inflicted, recounting stories of assaults, property destruction, and threats against minorities and community leaders. The defense had little to offer in return. Their attempts to paint the defendants as misunderstood patriots fell flat in the face of overwhelming evidence. Dennis Hunt's own words, captured in intercepted communications, became one of the prosecution's most damning pieces of evidence. "I don't care who gets hurt," Hunt had written in one message. "Fear is the only way to wake this country up. If a few of them have to bleed, so be it." As the judge entered the courtroom, the murmurs of the audience died down. Judge Caroline Whitmore was a seasoned jurist known for her firm but fair approach to justice. She settled into her chair and looked out over the courtroom. "This court has reviewed the evidence and heard the testimony," she began, her voice steady and authoritative. The actions of the defendants were not just criminal, they were an affront to the very principles upon which this nation was built. Hatred, violence, and terror have no place in a civilized society. She turned her gaze to Dennis Hunt. "Mr. Hunt, you were the leader of this group, the architect of its violent agenda. You used fear to manipulate others and targeted those who had done nothing but exist in a way that offended your twisted ideology. For your crimes, this court sentences you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The room erupted in murmurs and gasps. Henry felt a wave of relief wash over him as he leaned back in his seat. Jackson gave a small nod, his face impassive but his eyes glinting with satisfaction. Judge Whitmore continued, addressing the other defendants. "For your roles in this conspiracy, you are sentenced to terms ranging from 20 to 30 years in federal prison, depending on your level of involvement. Let this serve as a warning to anyone who thinks they can spread hate and violence without consequence." As the defendants were led out of the courtroom, Dennis turned his head toward Henry and Jackson. His face was a mask of rage, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. "This isn't over," he spat. "There are more of us out there. You think you've won, but this is just the beginning." Henry met his gaze, his voice steady. "No, Dennis. It's the end, for you." Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around as Jackson and Henry stepped into the sunlight. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust forward as questions poured out. "General Williams, how does it feel to see justice served? Mr. Williams, do you believe this will stop groups like the Iron Sons?" Jackson raised a hand, quieting the crowd. "Today's verdict is a step forward, but it's not the end of the fight. Hate doesn't disappear overnight, and there are still people out there who share Dennis Hunt's views. What this trial proves, however, is that we will not stand idly by. We will fight back with the law, with our voices, and with our resolve." Henry added, "Justice isn't just about punishment, it's about sending a message. To those who spread hate, you will be held accountable. And to those who've suffered because of it, you are not alone. We stand with you." Over the following weeks, the impact of the trial rippled across the country. The Iron Sons, once a growing threat, were dismantled at every level. Their members faced charges ranging from conspiracy to domestic terrorism, and the group's online platforms were shut down. Communities rallied together, inspired by the courage of people like Henry and the decisive action of law enforcement. Public forums were held to discuss ways to combat hate and promote unity, with Henry often invited to speak. His story of resilience and his determination to stand against hate resonated deeply, especially with veterans and civil rights advocates. Jackson returned to his duties as a general, but he remained in close contact with Laura and the other officials working on related cases. He knew the fight against extremism was far from over, but the trial had renewed his faith in the system he had spent his life defending. One evening, Henry and Jackson sat on the porch of Henry's home, a rare moment of quiet between them. The scars from the attack had faded, but the memories remained fresh. "You did good, son," Henry said, breaking the silence. Jackson smiled faintly. "We did good, Dad. Together." Henry nodded, his gaze drifting to the horizon. "There's still a lot of work to do. But maybe, just maybe, we've made the world a little better. Jackson placed a hand on his father's shoulder. One step at a time. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in a warm, golden glow, father and son sat together, united in their mission and their resolve. They had faced hate, endured its worst, and emerged victorious, not just for themselves, but for everyone who believed in a better, brighter future.